Hey, this is Matt from howtogardendesign.com, back for part 3 of my reaction to the second studio design process video slash podcast. We've gone through 2 parts prior, so if you haven't watched those, do so, and just continuing on listening, reacting to some of the comments they say, so enjoy.
The next test that I like to use quite often is a test of abstraction, which is to say that if you have this thing in front of you and you're trying to understand if it's good or bad or which direction you should go next, you basically make this thing more abstract than what it is. In the case of, let's say you're working on a floor plan, you do a diagram of the floor plan. Diagramming fits neatly into the abstraction test, and that's a big part of it, right? You're removing a lot of the miscellaneous stuff to see the more pure, naked version of that thing, to realize something about it.
That's really interesting. That's not something that I talk about or recommend a lot, but I think that is something that can be very useful. And I suppose to put something more concrete around it, if you wanted to do this for your own design, one way to approach that would be to think about the impact of a thing, right? So again, a garden bed would be a good example where I don't necessarily need to know the exact location of every single plant or item within the garden bed just yet. I know roughly the outline of where it is and where it's sitting in this design. And maybe to test it from an abstract point of view, I just like put a bunch of blobs there, or this kind of outline of color and kind of what the impact of that is going to be at a particular time of year, in this case because it's planting. And I just remove all the other kind of technical elements of the design, and maybe I've got a perspective drawing where I go out, I take a photo of my landscape, right, or of your garden, and you just put in what each of these impact things will feel like, upright vertical elements or colors, like a swash of colors. Like, you don't have to draw the items, you just got to figure out what the impact of that thing is going to be, and that can be an interesting abstraction to help you place some of the heavier elements in your design, or I guess feature elements. It could also be some of the smaller ones, like the smaller, more finely tuned, fine grain kind of elements as well. But I think of it as impact rather than abstraction necessarily. But I think it will be presented in the same way.
No, I think that's a good one. I think that's something that's used also like in the arts, right? As a way of composing, like composition, like you see the stronger elements, the balance, where things are, how it flows,
That's one, I think, I believe it's certain elements of Japanese, it could be bento boxes or food like that, where you have to eat through the little compartments in particular steps because it maintains a balance of the overall plate, which sounds bizarre, and I'm just quoting off something I read a long time ago, but I think that's where she's getting at. Like, you get a sense of adding and subtracting things from a particular view, for example, if you're in a garden, can help you determine whether or not you want something. Again, if you're standing at a particular point in your garden just outside your back door and you're looking out and you've already figured out that you've got feature elements here, here, and here, what happens if you put something right up here? I guess for you guys, it's like right up there, right at the front of your face. Or what happens if you move it, further back towards it? I think I should start doing this way, right? So it's just abstractly, like, you don't have to go and actually get an image or a picture or figure out where all the plants are going to go. Like, often we feel our environment abstractly, like we can't take in all the fine details of information. We just get sensors, impacts, be it views into or out of a particular space. So composition, again, is an interesting way of thinking about it, I think. And there are elements of design. I've got an article somewhere about design principles and other bits and pieces, again, on my website that explore that in a bit more detail.
Yeah,
and that could sometimes even reveal the thing that might be the strongest in the design that you haven't even realized was. But by doing that, you kind of, it's like you're squinting your eyes a little bit, to see a little clearer in what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say squinting your eyes, and equally too, and this gets to another point which I don't, is that you make it more abstract, and you could also make it less abstract. It's kind of like a dial right?
Right.
And you go one way or the other depending on how you're feeling.
Right. I mean, sometimes you do like floor plans and, well, you don't really grasp, let's say, the scale of the space you've designed. And once you start putting furniture and you're like, whoa, okay, like I'm like really out there.
Right, right. And that actually gets to, well, let's get to this other one first. The third one is the architectural criteria tests, and this is a big one.
Oh my.
So I think that there's, like before we're kind of outlining the difference between these tests and versus being a critic, right? There are different ways that you can critique a piece of architecture. So let's say that there are 6 main categories, and in each of these categories you can rate a piece of architecture like you would rate a movie on a scale of 1 to 10.
I was going to say you rate a sandwich.
I rate a sandwich from 1 to 10 to paint, yeah. That's
How's the bread? That's the big question.
So these are 6 categories, and it's not to say that these are the ultimate 6, that these are the 6 commandments, but these are roughly the big points, and there's maybe another few that are there. The first is a relationship to site. This is pretty obvious, right? This is something we all should know. This would involve massing, access to the site, location of the building, open spaces, and adjacencies. The next is program.
So I haven't actually watched this far into the video, but I'm guessing a lot of these will be quite technical. And, landscape is a little bit different. Similar, but a little bit different. But yeah, this may or may not be relevant to kind of how we think about the design process, but I suspect it will be.
Functions of the building, right? The third is the relationship to the local culture and people. The fourth is we're calling it technical integrity, which would include its structural kind of performance. And then fifth is sustainability. And then sixth is beauty. And beauty in this case includes form, materials, color, space, all of the stuff that we like to probably focus on more than anything else sometimes.
I like that. I like that set of things because I think, again, it applies a lot, pretty much all of it, to landscape design as well, just differently, right? The interesting one in people and culture, again, they're probably talking about, public buildings, public spaces, but in our case, it's really about you, the client, or you, the person living there, and other users of the space. But maybe it also goes a bit beyond that and is your neighborhood and the aesthetics of where you live, which is often informed, hopefully, by the climate and other bits and pieces and local materials and all those other things.
But so let's say you have those 6 tests or 6 categories. And basically you can approach any building, any project, and be like, okay, here's 6 categories. I'm your judge. I'm going to rate you 1 to 10 and whether or not you fulfill these categories. Now, I think that from the perspective of a critic, when the project is done, you can critique a project that way. Again, the same way you rate a movie in a sense. But in terms of process, it's very dangerous to try and think about a project in that way and to try and design a project that way. There's a number of reasons for that. The first is that in the design process, you have to realize that there is hierarchy between everything you're dealing with. The information you get when you're doing your research, there's hierarchy within there. You need to figure that out. But there's also hierarchy within these 6 things. So you should not think that during the design process that you should place equal importance on all 6 of these categories, right? And you should not feel like you have to, during the design process, be successful in all of these categories. Like, I need to get a 10 out of 10 out of all these categories by the midterm, by halfway through the design of the project. That's a terrible way to design. It won't work. It's not going to work because these 6 categories, you have to understand, they are totally indifferent to the story that is your design.
I agree with most of that. I wouldn't call the story of the design, which I think is the way they kind of conceptualize it. But you have to start with somewhere, right? It's the same thing if you were writing a book or a play or whatever. Often it can be character driven in terms of these are the people, and I don't remember what the terminology is for it, but a lot of characters, it's like, all right, I am a character, and the author thinks about how they would operate within that world and the decisions they make. Right, that's a very different approach to if an author has an entire plot set up and then the characters stick to variations within that plot or how they're going to approach it. But in this instance, maybe you're starting with your hunch and you're exploring different ideas, and then you bring in those constraints, which are some of the things he talked about in terms of, sustainability and a few other bits and pieces. So yeah, I like the idea that you're not going to be able to tick every box hand in hand, lockstep throughout a design. You have to start somewhere and push the envelope there and explore ideas, and then you'll start to bring in other elements to it. That's part of that circular helix process where you'll start to bring in more information, more constraints that will help shape and refine the kind of final product.
And is storytelling. They're indifferent to that story, and that story by default, by definition, is going to have hierarchy. It's going to have more important things and less important things. These 6 categories, which are encompassing the big view, they don't care about any of that stuff.
And those categories, like you said, and sometimes you decide what the hierarchy is, and some of them sometimes come with the project or the client or the site.
Right. That's true. And so when you force these 6 things on the project, either you're going to produce something that's incredibly boring and banal, it has no direction, no soul, no story, no concept, right? Or you're going to be completely paralyzed. And we see this actually a lot with younger designers. They get, let's say, feedback, and then they get feedback about all 6 of these things, and they go back to their projects, and now they're like, okay, I got to try and answer all of these 6 different categories halfway through the design process.
That's actually a really interesting point about feedback in general. Regardless of design or not, it could be the same with job applications, right? One thing that I like, I don't remember where I heard it in the podcast somewhere, but if you're getting feedback from multiple different people, particularly if neither or none of them have kind of a background in the area, or even if they do, often if people are bringing up the same problems, then it's a core problem that you need to address. But if people are bringing up completely different things every time, due to their own personal preferences or kind of subjective approach or thinking, don't necessarily turn around and try and respond and react and change based on that. Sometimes their ideas may be valid and they're worth investigating, but it's generally a lot stronger an approach if people who aren't there together but are in separate sessions bring back the same issues, and say, well, you've talked about this, but you've done this and it doesn't quite seem like it would work, or, oh, I don't think that will work. If the same people are all saying they don't think that would work, even if there's a feeling and subjectiveness about it, if they're all doing it, then maybe it's something you need to revisit. I know that's not quite what he's talking about here. He's talking more about, being at university or college or whatever and attempting to address critiques, which can be its own really big challenge. I think, the idea of trying to address them all at once in the middle of a design process can be really hard to do.
And they become, you become completely paralyzed.
Yeah.
Because it's almost impossible. Like I was saying also, when you force these 6 categories on yourself on the project, you can produce something banal. Like an example of this would be, okay, take any speech given by any CEO of any generic corporation. When they give a speech, right, it's incredibly boring, dry, has no soul, it's humanless. It's been manufactured, right? Why? Because they have a team of people who have these 6 categories that are trying to check off all of the boxes. Check, 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 equals good speech. No, it doesn't.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily, sometimes it's box ticking, but I think the other part of it is they have to be extremely careful, particularly in today's climate, to not say the wrong thing, right? You can't be candid because that can be blown out of proportion and taken poorly. You think about athletes giving interviews where they tend to say the same things over and over again because anything they say that deviates from that becomes more problematic and something they don't want to deal with. They want to reduce their variation in what they can expect to talk about. And the more boring you are and the more kind of safe you play it, the less problems you have because it's conventional, I guess.
It equals a decent speech, but it's so boring and not real.
Well, and that's what we said earlier, comes back at you, is that it's not a mathematical formula. There needs to be some dosing, there needs to be some sensitivity to which one is stronger than the other. Mm-hmm. It needs to be a balance.
If you think about, you do speech writing and also story writing. If your job is to write a story, and design is basically you're doing the same exact thing, but instead of words, you're using formal components, physical structures and things. If you try and write a story fulfilling the 6, categories of what makes a good story, like, I don't think anyone can write a story that way.
The other thing too is that it needs to. That's also what makes the project singular.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like if you apply the same 6 point and the equal hierarchy of all of them on all of your projects,
Right.
well, then it's just like formally it's going to be different, but like everything else is going to be close to the same. And why is this project even here?
Mm-hmm.
I think one way to think about that, again, this isn't a problem for amateurs, but for professionals, I guess, if you use the same solution to fix the same problem in all different places, then you function on the same thing. Like, a good example would be in landscape design, if for any kind of drainage situation or whatever, you use a wetland to purify and collect water, or you use swales as the area that will help divert water to these kind of things. Like, yeah, it looks cool and it's interesting, but if that's your solution every single time, then often you're not really thinking very deeply about the actual intricacies of that project and that place and how people are going to use it. And that's a challenge because people get comfortable with particular things, be it processes and be it materials and other options, because they know they work. And if you know something works, once you've gone through the process and you've got the built product and then you move away from it, yeah, you'll have, maintenance and care periods and things that you're liable for over a period of years, but you're much more confident you won't turn around and have issues later on because you've designed something new and finicky. So it's a bit of a push and pull kind of thing.
Why it could be swapped with another one you've done.
Right, exactly.
I mean, imagine if, like, as human, we were all equal on the 6 criterias applied to human bodies, right? Like, that would be ultra boring. That would be ultra boring.
Right.
You need mixity and diversity and different personalities and interests, and it would be ultra boring. We would be living on a TV set or in a fake world. But...
Yeah, Pleasantville.
Right. Well.
So that's in the design process. That does not mean that we are discrediting any of these 6 categories by the end of the project, right? So all of these 6 categories to produce a capital A piece of architecture, a great piece of architecture, should probably address all of these things. One could easily argue. But they should be addressed in a way that makes sense for your project, not simply to just check off the boxes.
Right.
So an easy example that we see very often is someone's in the middle of sustainability is an easy one to pick on. Someone's designing a project, right? And they get criticism. Okay, what about sustainability? You didn't address sustainability. The first response you might have as the designer who does have a story and a concept and a thesis, you would say that's clearly not that's not the point of what I'm creating. And then you come around to the next review, the next pinup, and suddenly they've solved sustainability with green roofs. Why do you have green roofs? Because it solves my sustainable problems, or whatever other thing they include in the project. Well, you have to solve sustainability in a way that expresses the story of the project, not just to include it in there to tick off the box.
Yeah.
That's what I was talking about before, in terms of if you're using the same solutions, the same programmatic solutions every single time, again, you might as well be creating the same design every single occasion, right? Like, there are different ways to solve similar problems. You don't need to keep using the same ones on every single project. But again, this is much more professional based than, individual based or amateur.
It always pisses me off when I see, like, sustainable tower, and it's like all white and there is, like, jungle balconies. I'm like, well, first, good luck maintaining that. And also,
That's actually a really great point. And I like the look of those aesthetically. I like the look of these kind of, large towers with jungle balconies. But it's one of those things that I look at often when people design something and they've got renders and beautiful things up, and you go, how are they actually maintaining that? Who's doing that? How does that work? Because if someone's doing it and they're getting paid for it, you bet that's added to body corporate fees, right? Like, there's a whole host of things that go into that. And I think, again, if that's always your solution to that sustainability or whatever climatized kind of problem, it gets stale pretty quickly, and it's derivative, really, because it gets used a lot by a lot of different places. But again, some of the studios just, that's how they bring in the money. You do the same thing again and again.
A poor way to approach dealing with sustainability for this specific project.
Yeah.
You know, like you didn't make it fit the project.
There's actually been a few of those that have been done, I
fit.
think.
Huh?
I think there's been a few towers that have been built like that.
How many? Every time you see a sustainable tower, that's the first. And the thing is, it's the first response. Like anyone who is not a designer would come up with, well, just put plants on your balcony.
Right.
Okay, great. That's why we have 5-year degree or plus to come up with that, you know?
I mean, I think
Just on that doesn't mean it's not a good approach. It just means that, as you said, like, if that's your default approach and you don't explore anything beyond that and it doesn't fit, you know, I talked before, like he talks about narrative and story. I kind of see it a little bit differently sometimes, but, you know, it's the concept and it's the hunch behind the design itself. If that doesn't fit at all, then again, you're just plopping something onto it to tick the box.
The topic is also a difficult one because there are some, you could easily say that some of these things have to be just integrated, period, no matter what, because, you know, we're running out of.
But it's sustainable. It's not just plants. That's, you know, the biggest, misconception that a lot of designers and people have in general.
You know, you can't just, I think what you're saying is also, you can't just copy and paste stuff into your project and then now be like, okay, problem solved.
Bingo.
Well, no. I mean, again, if you're writing a story, which you are, you can't just copy and paste whatever thing into your story to solve the category of, I don't know, what, mystery. Like, it doesn't...
I think it might be better to just say, like, it's not being treated.
Right.
Instead of, you know, doing that. It's more honest. It's more like, you know, sincere.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, too. I don't actually really care whether or not a piece of architecture or designer solves all of these 6 things. It's more of like, are you honest with yourself about what you're excluding and whether or not it makes sense for them to be excluded?
That can be a really hard thing to figure out, especially for amateurs, because you don't know, right? Like, you don't know what you don't know. So you can come up with something that really focuses on a couple. Like, it's really personal to you, the design that you've done. It ticks all the boxes in terms of how you will use the space or how your family will use the space. And it fits a style that you really like that's going to work with your kind of garden and all these other bits and pieces. And it's within a budget that you think you can afford. And we tick these 3 things that are really, really good. But then maybe you turn around and realize that, the materials, you know, sustainable, I'm not really going to use that term, but like maybe you can't source those materials, right? Or they're challenging to get, or they're not going to last particularly long, or all these other bits and pieces. There could be other problems that pop up that you haven't quite addressed yet because you didn't know you had to think about them at the time. And unfortunately, that's just the feedback loop, right? But I guess where he's talking about is, you know, professionals hopefully have an understanding of these 6 things that I've already forgotten what they talked about, but have an understanding of these and are intentionally ignoring some of them. I think that's different to how an amateur beginner designer would approach things, generally because of ignorance rather than knowing what they can get away with and understanding everything and then ignoring that.
If it makes sense for it to be excluded and you're aware of it, then fine. Like, I have no problem with that because it's more productive. One could easily argue for capital A architecture and for the development of the designer that it's more productive to produce something that actually has a spine and has a story and a direction that it's clear rather than one that's trying to satisfy everybody. Yeah. Right? It's the same thing as trying to satisfy a bunch of people with something that doesn't ever work. They just do what makes sense for the project.
So is there anything else with this test?
Yeah, the last thing is that you should not kick out ideas or designs that don't satisfy, obviously, these 6 categories. Like, sometimes you can come up with something that maybe only works in one of these ways, and ideally you want something that works in a number of ways. But it could be that that original design just needs to be morphed or reconceived rather than completely rejected.
I think the way I would describe it to people, beginner designers, is, you know, don't throw away your earlier designs, because again, the process I recommend is you explore all these different ideas, you get some basic designs outlined, you refine some of them further, you take them to experts if needed. The information the experts give back may help you refine your design further, or maybe you realize that, geez, none of this works, and you can get really despondent and kind of downhearted. But if you've got the work that you did previously to go back to and look at, with that extra knowledge, you can go, okay, cool, well, look, this one that I showed them didn't work for these reasons. Maybe it was too expensive. Maybe it wasn't even achievable. I can't actually build that, or they can't build that. Maybe it's going to be way more expensive because I need permits and all these other bits and pieces. Maybe I ignored regulations because I don't know about them, and they've turned around and said you can't do these particular things. Cool. What are the boundaries that I can do, right? And they can tell you. And you say, all right, well, maybe I need to have a paved or a decking area that, has to be within a certain size. Go back to some of your earlier designs that you explored and look at the ones that will now work within that framework. And that can be really helpful because, you may have thrown out that previous idea for a particular reason, but maybe you just need to tweak it slightly. And you can now use that to help move forward again. So again, it can be disheartening, but sometimes that's why it's useful to have your own work that you've done stuck up somewhere else, like on a wall somewhere, and just leave it there, and it will help kind of percolate in your brain a little bit, and something you can turn back to and say, actually, now I'm going to follow this course using the stuff I've already done.
Let's say, I don't know, I come up with a shark skeleton idea for my design, right? And I come up with that because I really like how I don't even know what that looks like, how the spine of the shark connects sort of the element.
That's funny because I actually did something similar at uni. I think everyone's done one of those kind of things. I had a whale skeleton in a park. I don't even know why, but yeah, the outlines of the rib cage and everything like helped form a structure that I don't remember what I was using it for, but interesting.
Together, and I think structurally that could be it, right?
Efficiency, right?
And then structurally, actually, it's a flop. It doesn't work. But I realized that the way the light goes through, it's incredible.
The shark skeleton example is very similar to like bird skeleton stuff. You've seen projects like this, right? I model my building based on a bird skeleton.
Like Calatrava stuff.
Right, because it's like super structurally efficient, and therefore it has reason, and that justifies the whole building. And meanwhile, like everyone else is like, okay, well, that's like 1 out of the 6 categories. I'm pretty sure you need to hit more than one category to have a successful project. But in the process of things, it could be that the bird skeleton or the shark skeleton, which initially was conceived as a way to solve the structural efficiency of things, and maybe also had formal, it was beautiful in a sense. Maybe that idea, instead of getting completely rejected because it's limited to those 2 categories, maybe that idea just needs to be reformulated. Because, like how do you fit program into a bird skeleton? Like, what does that have to do with the culture of people, unless they're bird people? You know what I mean? But so maybe it's instead of just kicking it out entirely, there's a way to either modify your understanding of it in that example more than modify it physically.
Or it's a stepstone toward another idea.
Right.
That's they haven't mentioned it, but it also touches on another concept of design, which is that as a designer, you can become really wedded to a particular concept or idea, and you push it and you follow it and you see where it takes you, and then after a while, it just doesn't work. This is where having someone experienced turn around and kind of tell you, look, I get where you're going, but it's too far gone, and it's not marrying up all of these other things that need to happen. And sometimes you have to kind of leave it and forget it and, go back to the start again, which can be quite sad.
That's a little more mature.
So, it's a balancing act, because we don't want to try and satisfy all the 6 things, even though that's your goal. You just don't want to become too obsessed with doing that at the detriment of the design process. So you can't categorically say that because of course if you stumble across a design and it hits all the marks, then that's great. But you do have to question, does my project still have a story?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's an interesting one because, I kind of agree. But at the same time, talking about hierarchy and the way you structure things, basically it just means, which one of those are you focusing on first? Again, we're getting pretty abstract, and this is, I think, more professional based, but one of the problems can be sometimes you get to the end and, again, using their sustainability example, you then just grab something that you bolt on to the project to tick that box, which I think can be hard. You have to kind of use the existing options and parameters and materials and approaches and whatever within the project to help reach that end. And it might not reach it perfectly compared to this other bolt-on solution, but it's probably more in line with the actual origin or nature of the project itself.
Right. And the opposite is if you have a great story, but you're only hitting one or two of the marks, there's probably something not right.
So the next test is developing the project, right? The first one is, what do I do if I'm stuck?
Yeah, so this is actually similar to the abstraction test. So abstraction was about taking that dial and kind of going making things blurry. This one, the dial is less to do with blurriness and more to do with just development. So if you're stuck, like one easy way to get unstuck is to just push forward and ignore the fact that you're stuck. To suspend disbelief and to say, like, I know that there are these problems with this. I know that these problems need to be addressed. But instead of just abandoning it, just move forward. Just move forward.
Yeah, because sometimes it might just be like it's underdeveloped, or you're looking at it not necessarily from the right point of view.
Yeah.
I feel like, right?
I think a good way to think about this from like a beginner landscape design perspective would be if you're bringing in constraints that you're aware of too early. And I talk about this in a few different places, but often we think about it and go, well, I've got a budget in mind. I'm happy to spend $10,000 on my overall landscape design. And as you're going through the process and you've explored these different ideas, you get to a point where you go, you've created this design, you then research a little bit about the different materials that you want to include or the actual cost to build it, and you realize you like under it by a third, right? You're like, it's going to cost you $30,000. Then you get a bit despondent and you go, oh man, I really loved what I had here, but to do it the way I want to do it, I can't afford it, right? But maybe you're just too early in the process and you're stopping short. So what they're talking about in terms of pushing forward, I think is valid, because sometimes it just takes where you go through and you change little bits here and there. And maybe one way that you can save money is, well, there's two approaches you can take, right? One way to save money would be to change your material palette so that you can get cheaper materials, or change layouts so that it's a less labor-intensive building construction process, and therefore it's going to be cheaper labor overall. Now, if you're not a professional, you're not going to know necessarily what that means, but that's where your research comes in. Again, we're talking about bringing information back into it. So, originally you wanted a deck, right? And you realize that this really large, amazing deck you had in mind is going to cost you $15,000 once you include the builder and the permits and all this other stuff. So maybe you change that material to something else that might be a little bit cheaper, like a paving area. Or maybe you change the area, the size of it, to reduce the cost there. And that then has flow-on effects here and there. Now, I'm not saying that you do each of those individually till you get down to a certain threshold. But what I mean is that by continuing to explore the design, you might get to a point where you realize you can get a similar feel and hunch and kind of expression for a cheaper cost. And the flip side of that might be that maybe you change your intended approach so that instead of trying to build it within the next 6 months, you go, actually, you know what? We're going to build it in phases, and we're going to build it over a number of years, and we're actually going to spend more. We're going to spend $20,000 instead of 10 over time to get the look I wanted to get. And if you've got, this is what I talk about all the time, if you've got a finalized design that you're happy with and does all the things it should do and ticks all these 6 boxes or whatever they're talking about, the next step is about how you phase it, right? And how you choose what to build first and when. And you can save up your money over time, or you can source materials cheaply. You can do all this stuff to help you get to where you want to go. And it's not just about dumbing the design down till it meets your budget. It could be about rethinking how you budget the design itself.
Disqualifying an idea a little too early, well, you might pass a very good one,
And it's the same.
That is like the crux of why I tell people to keep exploring ideas, because we tend to settle for convention and we don't push enough because we're already bringing in things, oh, well, I can't build that, right? I'm doing a DIY design and I can't do it. Well, see what you come up with, see what design you can get to that you're really happy with, and then learn. Or again, this is going to be too expensive at the moment. Well, see what you can come up with. change some bits here and there to reduce the cost if you can, or maybe I didn't mention it before, but maybe you get smaller plants, right? And you do all that planting yourself, and maybe you do irrigation and bits and pieces yourself to save costs here and there so that you can get the look that you want. And yeah, it might take a couple of extra years to kind of grow in and mature, but you'll save time. You'll save money. There's things you can do. If you stop yourself too early, who knows, you miss out on potentially magical designs.
Like if you imagine you had 6 different design options in front of you on a table, right? Little physical model things. It's very easy to look at the 6 and compare and contrast those 6, right? This one has their different attributes, but also which one's better or worse for different reasons. You're essentially doing the same thing in this project development test, but you're doing it through time instead of options on the table, sort of. So like, if you could be Doctor Strange and go forward in time and see the future.
I think what he's getting at, another way to conceptualize it is, you've got 6 designs in front of you, right? And let's say that, it's taken 6 weeks. And over those 6 weeks, the designer developed one design each week, and now they're presenting them to you, right, after the 6 weeks, and they're saying, here are the 6 options that we've got, right? And they're all different slightly, and they're all exploring different things, and some of them kind of, are an additional exploration from a previous one, that kind of thing. That is you coming in after they've explored multiple options. But just an easy way to do it is if you went to the same designer after 2 weeks and said, show me what you've got. And all you're seeing now is the original 2 first options that they've developed, and you don't know that there's another 4 that are coming that may be options you want to move forward with. And all you're doing is sitting here with 2. And it's easy to do that as an individual, because if you've done all the things that I talk about, in my guides and my website and stuff, where you've explored some ideas but you haven't really pushed them, there's all these potential options that you're leaving on the table that may be even better suited to what you want.
The amount of insight you would gain to the past or the present would be really valuable. It's the same exact thing. Like a lot of times we're stuck in the design process, but it's just because we need to go forward. And when you want to advance the thing, you develop it, you actually realize like, oh shit, like either my understanding of this was flawed and it actually is great, or okay, now I have a better understanding of why I was stuck and now I can pivot in a certain way, right? So the development, this new developed version is seen in comparison to the old one the same as if you had 6 options on the table right in front of you right now. Does that make sense, kind of?
Yeah. But you can get lost in the detail because, I don't know, imagine you have 6 options you're looking at and you're moving all of them forward. Like that could take a tremendous amount of time. So you got to make the moving forward very quick.
Yeah. I mean, you need to have an understanding of constraints,
Again, this is what I talk about with the project that the approach I tend to recommend, which is that you've eliminated certain options and you've got a core set of options. So 6 might be too many. It might be 3 options that you then want to explore. And of those 3, you take your time to explore the first one and you look at different iterations of that. Then you go back and go, maybe it does work, maybe it doesn't. Maybe I go back and explore the second one and again, different iterations. And the third one, different iterations. You might end up with 9 again, right? But then you can pick and choose from those. So that's just the process of refinement, really. It's like a tree that kind of goes in and out as you're weaving through it.
All these things. At some point, you just want to go forward enough to where you're starting to learn about the design, and you're realizing something about it. Past that point, you're probably just sinking time for nothing. But I think that this way of working is totally valid because if you think about it, even outside of the design process, when we produce something, there's varying levels of our understanding of that thing that we have. Sometimes I have an idea and I draw what I'm thinking about, and it's a direct expression of that idea. Other times I draw the thing and it takes me maybe a few seconds to really understand what I've just created. Other times it takes me 10 minutes. Other times it takes me a few days. Sometimes it takes years to understand the thing that you've created. So this distance between your own understanding as a designer and the thing that you create means, I think, therefore, it's okay for you to create things that you don't understand. It's okay for you to develop something that which you know is not good or you believe is not good, right?
This concept ties into kind of a more meta understanding of the world, which is at least for me, is, there's more things I don't understand than do. And yet sometimes we do things because they work first rather than understanding them first. If you think about throughout history, peasants farming, right, tried all sorts of stuff, and they developed these really sophisticated approaches to producing harvests. And they were basically uneducated, right? They didn't have the background, the technical expertise in what they were doing. They just knew that it worked, be it, Dutch farmers introducing or rotating crops so they could introduce nitrogen to the soil and all these other bits and pieces, or the way certain farms had, I guess they'd have these big kind of meadows and pastoral areas and stuff. And instead of that being just for one individual, within that area was dotted out multiple people's different little own patches of rows and whatnot, and they had them, I'm getting completely off topic, but they had them located over all these different locations, their own little rows, so that if one of them failed, they still had something to fall back on somewhere else. Like, they basically spread their risk, right? And this is quite sophisticated, particularly if you're just doing it by trial and error, which is how most of the world works. So I don't even know why I brought that point up, but I think that was similar to what he was talking about.
I think there's a hesitancy sometimes with this particular test, because it's like, why would I bother wasting time advancing something when I know it's shit?
And that's probably a common one that I think a lot of us would have, where we've done something either the opposite, where it works and we think it works and we don't bother looking beyond that, which is what we've spoken about before, or I'm doing something that it feels stupid and I don't really know why I'm doing it.
Well, you might know it's shit, but if you're stuck, this could be very helpful.
Well, and in the process of developing, you discover things, and you discover things that could be helpful for the other options.
Yeah.
Or you think about something you have not considered for any of the options.
That's probably a really good example where, again, design is this tree that spreads out and you have to explore all the individual arms and branches and twigs and all that off that. Because while you may not use a design, one design that you've done something, you may use an element that you explored in that design, and it could be the layout of a particular thing, or a combination of materials, or literally the position of where it is in the yard, and you bring that back and plop that into another design that you're exploring and see how it works there.
And I think this is also maybe super helpful for people who are perfectionists, which a lot of designers are, right? You don't want to produce something that's bad. So if you're at the, I don't know what, schematic design phase, perfect, I want to make the perfect schematic design. Yeah, I can't really do that though, right? You need to move forward to make it perfect. It's I think I've talked about this before, but it's the same thing of, this is pretty different, but like music performance, right? If you have a range of like how high and how low that you can play, and if like the excerpt or the piece that you're playing, the highest note is C above the staff or something, right? And you only play within that range. Well, that's not good. You actually want to go past that to give you the flexibility and a better understanding, in this case, skill set, to operate within the range of the piece. And it's sort of similar to this in a way, right? You need to go forward, and it's not wasted time.
Well, and it's
I don't know if that analogy works, but it touches on things we talked about earlier, which is mainly you almost need to prove what doesn't work. It's like a math problem, right? Like, you can get marks in an exam even if you get the end result wrong, the answer wrong, as long as you've shown you're working, right? And I think of design the same way, where you've shown to me that all these other options don't work for whatever reason. This is the one that I went with. To me, it may not be perfect, but it's there, right? You've shown you're working in the background. And I think that's kind of what they're talking about here, is like pushing through, exploring different ideas. Sometimes you don't understand why it does or doesn't work, but you keep exploring it.
like, when you're dating someone, well, you don't know, but I mean, you don't want to commit to spending the life of a person that you don't really know. Same thing. You don't really want to commit to one of those design options before you actually know like what's inside of them.
Yeah. The key is just to turn out that part of the brain that's perfectionist, in my case, and be like, let's just move forward. And then, I'm in the future now. Look at isn't this interesting? Now I can go back. Speaking of going back, also with this project development tests is the idea of going backwards in time.
And I feel like a lot of people and designers often have problems with going back, because going back or like moving back to your parents, anything like going backwards, it's not, it's negative.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason in our society, it's perceived as like this no.
Again, that's a fun analogy because, yeah, it's perceived as, something's gone wrong. But in a design sense, an example I think they're leaning towards is, let's say you've gone through this 3-month phase of developing designs and the client's chosen a particular option, or for you, right, designing your own backyard. You've gone through and you've done all this stuff and you've got to a point where you've kind of refined the design and for some reason it's not working for you, or you've spoken to people and it's just not that exciting, it's not working. The idea then that you go back to the drawing board and start again is seen as a negative, and it can feel that way because you're like, man, I spent so much time doing this. But again, it's the Edison principle, right? You haven't failed. You've just eliminated options to get you closer to something that does work.
It's totally fine. Like you're designing, there might be things that you've missed or you're stuck and you need to go back to research and, do a little bit more digging there because obviously you missed a step, you missed something.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't forget that the design process is basically just a bunch of tests. You're testing things, which is to say that even though there's a sense of direction, of course, you need to be loose. You need to be okay with going backwards a little bit and going sideways.
Again, what I talk about a lot, which is they haven't explicitly stated it yet, but if you're testing, you got to test against something, whether it's a pass or a fail. So again, for me, that's the criteria. And the testing is whether or not what you've done will fulfill the criteria for that space or for that overall design, whatever that looks like. And yeah, it's just testing, right? Like it's iteration. It's every time you test, you're not going back to the start. You're not designing the experiment again. You're using what you've already done and you've eliminated that option. So now you go on to the next one.
Going here or there and looking at things from different perspectives.
And sometimes some architects, some designers, they only design one option. Like, they have a client's project and they only do one option.
Well, they design one option or they show one option?
They only show one design.
Right.
Okay, what are the odds the client's going to like it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, just one thing I forgot about that they talked about before was in a similar vein, right? Think about all the songs that musicians will create, or think about all the paintings or whatever that artists produce. Like, not everyone is going to be a hit. I mean, you may feel that way if you're a fan, but I don't remember where I heard it or read it, but Picasso produced tens of thousands of paintings, right? And now we know him as an incredibly famous artist. He has a number of paintings that are worth millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's not every one, right? I mean, I'm sure collectors would like to think that, but reality is there's certain ones that I think experts see as the pinnacle of his work or that particular style or whatever, but not every single Picasso painting is valued the same way for whatever reason. So it's a similar thing here where, and something personal for me, like I like to show people my crappy drawings that I do on my sketchpad with all the colors, right? And I like to do that because I think that's the way real designers work. Often most people are exposed to the end products, which are the renders and the models and, the really beautiful illustrations and all those other things. But that's not how people design. You don't sit there and spend 4 hours exploring an idea through, perspective drawing. I think it's a useful approach, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be quick and messy and ugly, frankly. And I think you'd be surprised if you went to a professional office and you saw their reams and reams of trace or their particular ideas in 3D modeling, whatever it is, whatever medium they're using. If you actually saw all the failed attempts, you'd be really intrigued. You'd be like, oh, okay, that's cool. Like, I know that. It's like watching a musician practice rather than perform. Like, if they're practicing, they'll play poorly, or they'll get chords wrong, or they'll just make stuff up and get the order wrong and all these other bits and pieces. Like, seeing the failures will make you feel better in your own approach. You know that not everything has to be this kind of schmick span final presentation version, which I think a lot of people get into the trap of expecting and assuming you have to produce every time, and it slows you down.
What are the odds this is the best you can come up with? Right. Like having a range of options allows you comparison and evaluation between them and ultimately growth.
And you can combine
Yes,
them.
I agree, but is there a difference between showing versus designing? Like, a lot of designers will produce a bunch of things but not show the client, all the options, kind of.
Well,
That's more of a tactic.
there is a difference, but at the end, showing is the client's going to be the one making the decision, right? So if you made the decision of what you think the best option is and you show it to them, Well, they might not understand it. You know, if you show them the one you think is best next to the other two that you've done that you don't think are as good, it might be clearer for them to understand it. And I think oftentimes, you know, offices kind of underestimate the use of options because there is an order in which you show your options, right? If you want.
In some ways, this goes to, it's kind of nefarious and sneaky, but it's similar with sales, right? Again, marketing and sales options, where the best approach you can have is to have 3 options, and you have one that's kind of an entry level, really low, and people expect that. You know, you sell whatever this product is for $20. Then you have a middle option that might be $300, and it's much better, it's really good, blah blah blah. And then you have some completely crazy option that's $1,000, and it has all these little extra bells and whistles and stuff, but it's not linearly worth or better than the middle product. And what you're really trying to do is position it so that the middle product compared to the top one seems like much better value than the $1,000 option. And so people are willing to spend the $200 because they'd rather spend $200 on something that's 80% or 90% as good as the $1,000 option. And the $1,000 option is just there for those people who have the money and want the cachet and the prestige that goes with buying and spending $1,000 on whatever this particular thing is. I think that's kind of where they're getting at in terms of, if you've got a design that you really like and you're sharing it with other people, sometimes comparing crappier designs to this one that you really like will kind of, you know, help push the client towards that particular option.
One option to be selected versus another.
Yeah.
And for someone who's completely out of the process, they don't know all the things you've been considering and explored. So at least showing them a range.
Well, this also reminds me of, this is actually not really related, but it reminds me of that there's another kind of way of working. It's not a test per se, but it's a way of working where if you're stuck, you just produce a bunch of options, like the shotgun approach, right? So you have
design charrettes,
right? This search for conceptual clarity, where you're trying to make the murky image become clearer, is there, but also you can't allow yourself to be stuck in that one train, right? Sometimes you just blow it up and spew out a bunch of options just to get loose and to see things again, as you said, like within that greater context, right? But in terms of going backwards, I think the reason why it's difficult is that it requires the designer to acknowledge that they've fucked up and that they've made a mistake, and that what they've produced, not only is what they produced not good, but in order to fix it, they have to go backwards, and there's a sense of like lost progress.
Well, there is a sense of failure, like you failed.
Yeah.
You know, and that's not a taste that a lot of people are okay with having.
I think it's also parallel to like why we stay working in one medium, one computer or sketching, because I haven't made it work. It's not good yet. Well, I'm going to fucking make it good. Keep going and going and going. Well, no. Just shift. So the going backwards thing, I think there's a lot of examples for that. And even when we had our conversation with the architect Anne Fugeron on this podcast, it was actually something that she remarked, was both the computer example and also the going backwards, that when they're stuck in their office, and this happens for pretty much all the designers I've ever spoken with, there's something about the previous step that they did incorrectly or they missed, and that's the key. And even with like when working with students, it's most of the time it's like, yeah, let's go back a few steps and look at what you did here, because that set you on the wrong trajectory, right? And that's also the going backwards is just super important. It applies to everything, even when you're talking to a client.
I think this is really hard. You know, it's hard for experts, even hard for beginning experts. And I think it's almost impossible for amateurs to kind of figure out where they went wrong, because you don't have that experience. So my critical advice from this whole kind of thing and exploration and listening and conversation is that you have to be comfortable with going back to the start, because you're never truly going back to the start. You're going back to a position with more knowledge and more understanding of what won't work, and that will eventually push you towards what will work. So going back, particularly for beginners, is really important, because like I said, there's so much you don't know. There's way more that you don't know than what you do know. And if you've developed this design that you really like and you take it to an expert and they shoot it down for a number of really legitimate reasons, yeah, it sucks. It can be really disheartening. But again, that's just more information that you're taking in, that you go back to the start of the drawing board and you know now the limitations and constraints that will apply to the final outcome. And you didn't know that before. And so you can operate. I'm not saying now you have that completely dictates your whole design, like you can still explore things, but you know that at some point you have to end up fitting things within these constraints that you didn't know previously. So I think it's always useful, and it should be something you should expect to go back and you don't even know what went wrong. Like you can't, like what they're talking about is, you go back to the final step and you find something that you should have done better. It's like, well, you won't know, right? So you almost have to go back repeatedly. So I talked before about the little helixes. Oops. Yours are going to be really big, right? Big ovals where you go back to the start again. But anyway, that's something that you may expect as you go through your design process.
Client, like, but yeah, why do you want to do this, right? What is the motivation? What is the underlying reason?
Well, and I think it has to do with honesty too. Like you have to admit to yourself if you know that something is not right, or you've missed a step, or you need to go back.
And I think by going backwards, you can either incorporate, it's not just breaking loose and all the kind of like fear related issues, but it could be that you just need to incorporate more ingredients into the thing you're working with. And a lot of times when
just on that, sometimes it's less, right? Sometimes things are too busy. And one way to step back from things is to eliminate options until you get down to the skeleton and you realize that the skeleton of what you've got is good, and you've got too much other stuff happening, too many materials, too many colors, trying to incorporate too many spaces and layers and all these other bits and pieces, and you've got to actually step back and go, well, I don't need a pond, or I don't need a water feature, or I don't need these other bits and pieces. I don't need to create a children's play area that they're going to not use in 5 years, or maybe I have a temporary one that I can pull down at some point. Like those kind of things, right? Where sometimes taking things away can be just as good as adding them in.
Become stale and stagnant. It's like either you can try to re-understand that thing and reformulate that thing, but sometimes you need to inject more information into it, right? Bring in more ingredients from the research to shape.
And just on that touches back, getting expert opinion is that more information, that those ingredients that will help constrain and define things for you.
To change the equation that you're dealing with at that moment in time. And it's similar to or develop it further, right? Bring more stuff into it. As you said before, like in a floor plan example, is this floor plan good? Okay, well, let's see. Let's put furniture in it. Let's detail it out. Let's look at the elevations and whatever else to see if this actually works. You can't stare at a floor plan and assume it's going to work out and just by working in that phase before developing it further. It doesn't work that way. So the forward back idea I think is important.